Marshall's buyers are hustling hard to get amazing new gifts into stores, right up to the last minute. Like a designer perfume for that friend who never RSVP'd. Wish list topping toys for her kids who came too. Belgian chocolates for the neighbor. A cozy scarf for your boss. And a wool jacket for your husband that you definitely did not almost forget. Marshalls. We get the deals, you get the good stuff. Even at the last minute. Find a Marshalls near you.
We are
Cultivate.
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 Cultivate. We are Cultivate.
Hello and welcome to Yield Crime, where we discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear. I'm your host, Lindsay Valenti, and joining me today is a very special guest, Cinda Gault. Cinda Gault holds a PhD in English, specializing in Canadian national identity issues in women's writing of the 1960s and 1970s. She teaches and writes about Canadian literature and lives in Toronto, Ontario. Her fiction includes This God-Forsaken Place, a historical novel set in 1885 against a background of the Louis Riel Rebellion, with appearances by Riel's general, Gabriel Dumont, and Wild Bill Cody's Wild West show star Annie Oakley. And today we'll be discussing her book, A Small Compass. In 1806, Isobel Gunn is staring down the inevitability of a spinster's farm life in the Orkney Islands of Scotland, often referred to as the Island of Women. At the same time, and across the ocean in Maskinongé, Quebec, Marie-Anne Gaboury is facing the prospect that her dashing new coureur de bois husband will leave her a fur trade widow when he returns west to the wilderness. Both women launch themselves on perilous voyages that will change them forever and transform them into legends. A Small Compass is the story of the first two women to venture into the Canadian wilderness, where they meet and must help each other battle what they know and what they don't to defend all they love. Cinda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
And before we dive into the book, can you tell our listeners more about you and what motivated you to be an author?
Okay, I can give you the long or the short story of that.
Whichever you prefer.
Okay, well, I did not plan to be an author. I had a fairly tumultuous adolescence, but I always knew I wanted to go to school. I loved school. I always loved reading and writing, so that was always front and center for me. But I followed my interests, and that took me to being an undergrad in psychology at the University of Guelph in the 70s. And I was one of those feminists running around setting up rape crisis centers and shelters for victims of domestic violence and that sort of thing that we were doing at the time. And I became the first director of Women in Crisis, and it was my job to set up the actual shelter, which I did. And when I finished that, I realized I had been working with victims for a long time, and I wanted to go ahead and check out some perpetrators. So I became a prison guard in the maximum security wing of a men's prison where they held inmates convicted of sexual assault or arson or just had mental or emotional problems. And I did that for 13 months. And then I went on to do my MA in criminology at the University of Toronto. And I did my thesis on domestic violence. And when I graduated from there, I got the job of my dreams as director of a social service agency, and I hated it.
Oh,
so
no.
I did. I realized about myself, I do not like managing people. I don't like it being my job to make sure other people are doing their jobs.
Sure.
That strikes me as being somebody's mummy, and they weren't cute enough to have a mummy. So I was sort of facing some decisions I was going to have to make. And so I made three of them. And the first one was that I would become a writer, because I had to figure out what would I find so deeply meaningful that I was willing to put up with whatever I needed to put up with, or bleed for whatever I needed to bleed for, that would still feel really important to me. And I decided writing stories would be that. But I also needed to make a living, so I decided I would write a romance. And I'd never read a romance before. So I now began consuming them by the dozens to try to figure out how to do them. And they're hard little suckers to write, I got to tell you. So I ended up on a path where I published a novel called Past Convictions, became a Harlequin super romance in 1988. And that's a whole story because I just recently got my rights back for that, and my current publisher is republishing it. So I needed to revise it. And it's kind of weird revising something you wrote 37 years ago,
I
because
can imagine.
I wrote it on a manual typewriter. I had no electronic copy of it, and I needed one.
Oh,
So I'm thinking I have to type the whole thing out again. And my millennial kids are saying, no, Mom, there's such thing as an image to text software that in 2 hours I got the whole thing. But I had phone booths and landlines and tape recorders, and it's just
yeah.
remarkable how much has changed. But the technology had changed, but I was pretty pleased to see that the love story didn't need to change. I mean, I
That's
suspect
good.
people fall in love much the way they always have,
Yep.
and so that helped. So that I worked on that. And the second thing I decided I needed to do was to go back to school in English, because I had been in the social sciences, and if you tell a fictional story the way you write a social science essay, it's going to be a crashing bore, because you're going to find out who done it on the first page. So I wanted to go in and sort of see what my background is of this new choice I had made in life. And so I started back in school in English, and I went and did another MA, this time in English, and then I caught fire and went on and did a PhD. And as you said, my focus was on female Canadian writers who came to publishing prominence in the 1965 to 1980 era. And I chose that because that was the era of second wave feminism. And Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister for much of that time. And Canadians were having kind of a feel good moment about themselves for those years. And both of those things came together in the work of these three women writers. They considered themselves female Canadians. And so I was looking at how that was represented in their work at the time.
Mhm.
And then the third thing I decided to do was have my babies. So I had my two boys at this time. And I know that you have at least a daughter. So if you want to make
I have
somebody.
two daughters.
Okay. Well, I had two sons. Now I've got two granddaughters. They each
Oh,
had
okay.
a daughter 3.5 months apart. So I kind of have twins as granddaughters,
Wow.
keeping me quite busy. But anyways, so that's if, I went back to grad school with a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. So it
Oh, wow.
was always something I had to fight for my writing time, which makes it very precious. And now I'm fighting for my writing time again with a new generation, but
There you
it
go.
still keeps the writing precious. So that's largely how I came about to be a writer. And when my boys went off to university and I completed my dissertation for my PhD, I was teaching, but I also had time to go back to my writing, because I had published Past Convictions by then, but then I had done mostly academic writing for the intervening time. And I decided that I would start by, I just felt like I wanted to be free. I wanted to be galloping across the prairies with the wind in my hair, feeling free. So I
Hmm.
decided that I would research the Jesse James gang in your state.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was really surprised at how close the history that was going on in the United States, mainly Minnesota, how close
Hmm.
that was to what was going on in Canada at the time. And that was the
Hmm.
Louis Riel Rebellion. So a wounded Jesse James gang member makes an appearance in this godforsaken place for there. And so it was through research for that story that I discovered in a fur traders journal a little asterisk at the bottom of the page that said an extraordinary thing happened tonight. And this is the sort of the head of the fur trading post that's at Pembina, which is directly south of Manitoba. It's in North Dakota now. It was in Canada back then. And he said an Orkney lad, and an Orkney lad was referencing the place where the Hudson's Bay Company hired all their employees. They would send a ship
Hmm.
over to Stromness each year to pick up the employees, because apparently the Scottish farmers were a lot easier to get along with than the British ones. The British young men their ages were. So they hired them from there. So an Orkney lad just gave birth to a baby on the hearth in the fur trade. So she was busted. And my head exploded thinking, oh my God, that's a story just waiting to be told. So I ran out and to try to find out who she was, what her name was, and it was Isobel Gunn. And I realized that another writer had beaten me to the punch and already written a novel about her. So I got the novel and I read it, and I was just shocked at how differently I saw both Isobel Gunn and John Scarth, and just generally the story. So I thought, well, I'll write a story from my perspective about what that. There's only so much that can come down through history, right? You
Sure.
can get
Yep.
dates and events that happen, but you can't know what somebody was thinking or feeling, what their secrets were, what their loves or disappointments were. So that's what a fiction writer breathes into an historical story. So that's what I did. And I was well along on that when I discovered another piece of history and research that said that there was another woman out there, same place, Pembina, same time, and they had babies 1 week apart from each other. And there's no record of these two ever having spoken or having known about each other or anything. So I revised the whole plot so that it was intervening journeys and them winding up in the same spot. So that it just kind of developed as I discovered things. So there's the long answer. My father used to say, I just asked a simple question.
That's a great introduction to one of my questions, which is, the story A Small Compass discusses the lives of two very different women, Marianne and Isobel. And can you explain a little bit about who they both were?
Isobel was a farm girl in the Orkneys. And because this was the island of women, because the men either went to Canada in the fur trade or they were pressed into fighting Napoleon. So there were just no men left. So she had 5 sisters and they were just going to be farming for the rest of their lives. They were not going to have a chance to have their own families, do anything interesting in their own way. People used to hope that there would be sailors wrecked out in the sea so that maybe a sailor would wash ashore and somebody'd get a husband. But other than that, the prospects were pretty dim that they were going to have anything of their own. So she wanted adventure. She wanted to go someplace and do something. She could see her whole life just being what happened today was just going to be what happened each day for the rest of her life. So She was willing to take a bit of a chance on that. But one way that I diverged from the previous novel that had been written was the other novel showed her getting on that ship without anybody knowing who she was. And I had a very hard time thinking that was the case because Stromness today is 2,500 people. And people who are in small towns, they get up in your business pretty fast, you know, and they if they don't know you, they know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows you, or your brother or your sister, or your parents or whatever.
Yep.
And in addition to that, the way that apprentices were recruited was that a veteran employee would present the apprentice, who was a 14 to 16-year-old boy, to the recruiter and kind of vouch for him. So it seemed, how is she going to do that on her own without somebody helping her? Mm-hmm. So I saw John Scarth. John Scarth was a friend of the family. He was a friend of her brother who had been over in the fur trade. And so I saw him as kind of the big bear of a man who just, had a heart of gold and just would let her push him into anything. And in the other novel, he was a rapist. And I just saw him as such a nice guy. So it was just so differently I saw that. So she was kind of the adventurer, you wouldn't really call this a career, but she came over for work. Maria Gaboury was the housewife of the 19th century in that she had not planned, did not particularly want to go out west to have an adventure. She would have been quite happy if Jean-Baptiste could have done what he intended to do, which was buy a farm when he came back after 7 years being out, being a free man trader. But he didn't know that the Napoleon War had changed everything while he was gone. There was no internet at the time for him to keep up on what was happening in the world. And wood had become really expensive to make the ships to be fighting Napoleon. So no one was selling anything because they had the wood rights on their properties and they were selling that. So he would have had to go and get bushland and clear the bush, and it would take him 5 years to even plant something. So she was presumably pregnant very soon after they got married. And so he had to go back out west. And she basically gave him an ultimatum and said, you take me or that's the end of that. You won't see me. You won't see your kid. That's the end. Mm-hmm. And they were desperately in love with each other by all accounts. And so she became the first actual passenger in one of those canoes, usually it was the coureur de bois who were doing the paddling. And she actually got to go out there with them. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the 19th century version of the housewife and the career woman.
Yes.
And interestingly, they both wind up in the same place doing the same thing at the same time.
Yep.
So it shows that there are many roads to Rome,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So can you explain, just because it has such significance on kind of the story and how both of the women's paths intertwine, is for people who aren't familiar with the Hudson Bay Company, what it is and kind of why it was so important?
In the 1600s, exploration started to happen and people came and were not only discovering the New World, but were starting to do business in the New World with trading furs. In Europe, people really liked fur coats and fur hats and fur gloves. And so there was a big market for beaver, for bison, for the furs of North America. So King Charles II, I believe it was, gave a charter to a private company, being the Hudson's Bay Company, to come over. And it was Rupert's Land, it was called at the time. And it was the vast swath of Canada right out west, and gave them a charter to do business in the fur trade. And they were given that authority by England, who was coming over here and actually doing the trading. Native people would beg to differ. Who are you to be giving anything on this land? But that's what they did. So they established many fur trading posts along the rivers. They came in by ship over the Atlantic and then down through Hudson Bay down to James Bay, and set up Fort Albany, and then all kinds of little posts as they went along. And what they would do is they would meet native people who would hunt and come, and they would trade for, basically it was furs for guns was the most popular thing, because hunting became much easier if you had a gun. And so they did business quite happily for 200 years, and everybody kind of profited from it. And to the point where you would have much intermarriage that went on. You would, because, and that's the same as anywhere. You do business with people and you solidify your business relations by intermarriage. And that, that makes everybody feel like the relationship is going to last. So there were many gifts given of Hudson's Bay, the striped logo of the Hudson's Bay coats and blankets and that sort of thing. And they did business like that for a very long time. Now, you had another company start up years after they did, called the Northwest Company. And they were mostly Scottish and French. The Scots did the paddling and the French did the paddling and the Scots did the investing. So they started up and they became big competitors with the Hudson's Bay Company. And they would be out in the wilds, and things at some point got pretty violent sometimes. And because what the Northwest Company did is they would go out farther to meet the native people coming in their canoes with the furs and buy up their furs before they got to the Hudson's Bay posts. Hudson Bay would kind of sit there and wait for the native people to come to them, and then they would do business because they set up all these posts. The Northwest guys would go out there and intercept them and divest them of their trading goods. And of course, this would adversely affect Hudson's Bay. Now, eventually, Hudson's Bay won out in the sense that they didn't pay that much more for the furs. So the Northwest Company they were not viable financially by sort of 1821. But at this time, they very much were. There is actually a scene in This Godforsaken Place. It's a story that comes up in This Godforsaken Place about a trader that was earlier in the century who was told by the Hudson's Bay Company, because they had the charter, so they made all the rules. And they made it so that traders were not allowed to trade with the Americans, because the Americans would pay pretty much double what the Hudson's Bay would pay. And so they charged these three traders, and they were in the process of deciding the guilt when 500 of their Métis brethren on horse surrounded the court and awaited their outcome. And so the people inside decided to solve their problem by finding him guilty, but giving them no punishment. So, it was kind of a Wild West situation that way, in that they were being challenged on, well, who are you to be deciding who we can and can't trade with? And, in those kinds of situations, might is right. These were the establishment of how to run new countries. And so there was, a lot of challenge going on. So that's the Hudson's Bay Company, and it has just gone bankrupt. After all of these years, it started up in the 1600s, and it is this iconic, Canadian business that has just met its own Waterloo in contemporary times.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Mm-hmm. So how did you research the routes that the early travelers took in this book?
The richest source of documentation that is, you have secondary sources and you have primary sources. And I had a wonderful secondary source about Marie-Anne Gaboury by Maggie Siggins. She was a journalist who collected all kinds of information on the route that Marie-Anne Gaboury took. And it was remarkable how much portaging had to be done, what wild and wonderful things that they came across on that route. So I was able to kind of stand on her shoulders. She had done the primary research. And so she had it all laid out beautifully about where they went and how they got there. The primary research I did was at the Hudson's Bay Archive in Winnipeg. And there's one thing about the Brits, they were really good at keeping records. So they have a whole big building in Winnipeg of primary documentation. All of those factors, each of the fur trading posts in the Hudson's Bay Company were called factories, and the head guy was called the factor. And it was his job to write out in a journal every day everything that was happening at that post. So he would write out who was going where, they're bringing provisions to Martin Falls, or they're, wherever they're going, whatever they're doing. They did all their own hunting. They did whatever planting they could do. They built boats. They built cabins for the employees to sleep in. So there was much activity going on as trading was happening all the time as well. So what I wanted primarily when I went there was to find out where Isobel was when she got pregnant. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if she was off on the river somewhere at some other post where she was. So I was able to go in, and you have to put on these special gloves and have a special pencil. You can't go rifling through their stacks looking for a particular volume of something. You have to ask them, and they go get it and bring it to you. So I was able to actually have the journal that the factor wrote in at the time that she must have gotten pregnant, because count back the 9 months, I knew when she had the baby. And there was much construction going on at the time of new cabins for the employees. So she didn't have to be in a big room with 12 bunk beds with, all of the 24 men. John Scarth was enough of a veteran that he would have had pull, that they would have been able to get a cabin and have a certain amount of privacy. And so that I knew then where it happened. I was also able to get the captain's manifest for the ship that she came over on. Oh, so cool. I knew, it gives me chills when you see the calligraphy back then was just beautiful. Mm-hmm. And the captain wrote out the list of all the men he had just hired. And it gives me goosebumps when I see on that list John Fubister, because I know that's Isobel. And when he wrote that name out, he didn't know it was Isobel. Yes. And then for the rest of the manifest, I know every day what everybody's doing, all the chores they're doing on the boat, everything that's going on, that it's his job to keep track of and to keep a record of. So there was obviously a whole life going on below the radar of the people who were in charge. Mm-hmm. For Isobel to have been able to get under that radar and stay under it for 18 months. And, she was by all accounts, she was a heavy set brick shithouse of a woman. Like, she was a farm girl. So she was used to doing rough work just like the men were. So this was not anything that was a problem for her, coming over and doing the work that she needed to do. And it must have been very exciting for her.
Yeah, I would imagine. Just because I had to look it up because I couldn't remember. For those that might not be familiar with the dish, what exactly is pemmican?
Pemmican is a way of treating, it could be any kind of meat, but it was bison meat. When Marie-Anne got out there, her husband was a hunter. that's what he did. So he would go out and hunt, and he would send back the bison fur, but they would have 800 pounds of meat to deal with. So that was the role of the native women who were out there, is to dry. You'd have to butcher it first. Yep. And then you'd have to make it into strips and dry it, and then crumble the fat in with the meat, because they didn't have refrigeration. So with the way they actually prepared that meat would be edible for a year, and they could sell that as well. But people lived on it. There was a cart also that was invented for that purpose and for that landscape, the Red River cart. And it was just on 2 wheels, so that it could go over rough land, and it could turn very quickly. And that's what they used for the meat. And years later, when I was doing this godforsaken place, you're fast forwarding from 1806 to 1885. The bison they were becoming extinct, so they were farther and farther out west. So the hunters had to go farther and farther out west to find them. And it was not unusual for Gabrielle Dumont to be leading a hunt that would be 200 of these Red River carts all in a row. And they didn't have oil on their wheels. So those wheels screeched and 200 of them screeching across the prairies. It must have been something else. So she learned how to do that work. It's very rough work. Now, she had not been as much of a farm girl as Isobel was, and her mother remarried because her father died in a farm accident, and she remarried quite wisely because she got herself off the farm and with a store owner in the village. So that's why by all accounts, she was drop dead gorgeous. And she was not going to be a farmer's wife. And 26 is quite old at that time for a woman not to be married. They were both 26 when they started out. So that's one reason why Jean-Baptiste would have been so attractive to her, because he was not a farmer. And he came back from the West. I imagine him as wearing this sexy fringed leather jacket and telling hair down to here and telling stories of adventure. And she was swept off her feet by that.
Yeah, I pictured him very much almost like a Davy Crockett type of, with all the furs and the skins, and looking like he stepped right out of the wilderness. And
he could carry us all off to the wilderness, I'm sure.
Yep, exactly.
They became quite a power couple. Like after this whole story was over, she had a pile of kids. And they have roads and things named after them out in Saskatchewan.
You share a lot about the Indigenous peoples of the area. So what kinds of research did you have to do to kind of unravel and portray like their stories as well? Because it's not just about the women and their struggles. Like there's a lot about the other people who were in the area as well.
Yes. Now, I did not tell their story because their story is not my story to tell. So the information that I got was probably mostly from Maggie Siggins's book.
Okay.
And the research that she did. But when they were all sort of gathered around the Northwest Company's post, so it had a palisade around it, and it had a transitory village sort of leaning up against it outside. There were wigwams and teepees and just any kind of shelter that was temporary that could be thrown up and taken down very quickly. And because hunters were always coming and going, and this was a fur trading post where they were doing their business. So they would come in if there was a inclement weather, like a big blizzard or something, and everybody needed to get to safety. Everyone would come inside the palisade and just set up there. But under normal circumstances, they would stay outside. Another reason they'd come inside is the Sioux, which were a tribe farther out west, were a very warlike group, and they didn't like anybody who was there, and they didn't like anybody who was working with the Europeans. So that means the Cree, who are the ones who are mostly doing the trading and hunting the bison, they were as vulnerable to war party attacks as the Europeans were. So that would be another reason, if the Sioux were around, they would all get inside the palisade and get protection. So I learned about that. And then they did mostly hunting. And I don't want to talk about why Jean-Baptiste had a problem when he got her out there or
Yes,
anything.
yes, yep.
But things were well along as far as how Native people and Europeans were getting along at that time. And Sokanon is fictional.
Okay.
I made her up, but because whoever she was, there's no record of her name. So,
okay.
So I made that part up.
Okay.
Say no more.
Yep, exactly. You have to read the book to understand. So you kind of mentioned that Marianne, her story after this is very well documented, because she and Jean-Baptiste go on to have a gaggle of children. But what happened to Isobel?
Well, what happened to Isobel is what happened in the story. When she was discovered, she could not continue on in the capacity that she was in, being an employee. Now, why she couldn't do that was not because she couldn't do that, because Native women carried their kids around and went with their men in the canoe. So there's no reason why she couldn't have, but she couldn't have because she wasn't there. She was there under false pretenses and she had just been busted. So and they weren't going to let her do that. But you have to give them credit in that they let her work out her contract. She had a 3-year contract and she was 18 months into it. So they let her go back to Fort Albany with her baby and basically be a washerwoman for the rest of it. So that when she did go back to Stromness, she went back with some money in her pocket and her baby.
Yep.
And she probably wouldn't have been able to have a baby if she had stayed there.
I won't spoil anything, but that section of the book made me very angry because I could see that happening and I was like, not cool. But yeah.
So, I mean, you have to give it to her. She figured a way around it. And she had the courage to go out there and sort of pit her own ingenuity against, the men that she worked with, yes, many of them would not have known who she was, but some did. Some must have. Mm-hmm. And they didn't seem to have a problem with it. As long as she did her work, they didn't care who she was.
And it seemed like a lot of them genuinely cared about her in some capacity and were protective of her when everything came to light with the baby and everything, to the point where she was kind of able to fulfill her contract without a whole lot of pushback.
There's also another dynamic going on there where the Scots were, they like to see the Brits made fun of or duped or whatever. Yep. I mean, who doesn't, right?
Yep.
So they would have gotten a big charge out of helping her make them look like idiots. That would have been something that they would have had some chuckles about. And then when they found out that, you can just imagine the guys with the cigars back in England finding out, that they had a woman working for them for 18 months. Now, the reason that the Hudson's Bay decided on that policy came from an incident, because in the beginning, the men were able to bring women. There was a high up trader, and he had his wife and the nanny with them. And England and France were at war with each other for like hundreds of years.
Sure.
And when they came over here, it's not as if the animosity stopped. So they had a terrible incident where his wife and the governess were both taken prisoner, and he would have done anything to get her back. So they wanted to just cut that, and they wanted him to fight for Hudson's Bay, not be more concerned about his wife. So it's everywhere women go, they just bring trouble, Yes. So they decided, well, it's just best not to have women. But if it's amazing how far and wide the ramifications were of that one little policy, because the whole existence now of Métis Nation being the coming together of two cultures would not have existed if European women had accompanied their husbands. There wouldn't be a whole nation of people who are the combination of both. And that exists nowhere else in the world. That is completely something that arose out of the Canadian fur trade.
That is a good point. If you had the chance to kind of meet and chat with both of the women, What sorts of questions would you ask them?
Well, the things that don't translate down through history, what they thought of things, how they felt the moment. I was as a writer, I'm picturing her on the ship when it finally gets out of that channel. And, the really dangerous part is when they're near shore, because that's when she could be put back.
Sure.
And when
yeah.
they actually get out onto the sea and the wind's in her hair and she's thinking, oh my God, I'm actually doing this. I've gotten this far with it. How much of that is exhilaration? How much of that is fear? I would love to hear her describe how that felt. And, her impressions of the people over there. I think John Hodgson, the Fort Albany factor, was quite a character himself. And it would be interesting to hear how she perceived the different men she was working with.
As you've mentioned, you have written other historical works about women. Would you like to share with our listeners a little bit more about what those are?
Sure. And their crimes. One thing, just before we leave a small compass, I thought it was an interesting thing when Isobel is worried about getting out of the harbor. She's thinking, I don't know who it would be worse to be caught by, a reverend or a jailer, whether this is a crime or a sin. And it's, you're interested in history and crime. What was crime and what was sin was a struggle between the church and state about who was going to have jurisdiction over what. And the most stark view of this is abortion, which for centuries was an ecclesiastical sin. It was something that was adjudicated by the church. And then you come into, 16th, 17th, 18th century, and you have the state encroaching on the church's authority, and they take it away. So that in 1803, you have the Ellenborough Act that consolidates a bunch of sort of piecemeal laws that the state had encroached with and put it all together into an act. And it roamed around for a while, for years after. At some point, the penalty was death. And at other times, it was less so. But it's fairly recent historically that the state has even thought of itself as in charge of that as a crime. So things, we, from this point in history, we think things are cut and dry as far as what's legal, what's not legal, and how it is. But there was much more fluidity to it than that. And, the rules by which, the rules of civil procedure, that sort of thing, they have a history too, as to when they were actually invented. And the whole rule of law was something that happened, during the Enlightenment at a certain time and for certain reasons. Yep. And it's interesting now. When I was doing this godforsaken place and the Louis Riel Rebellion, I was struck by how new everything was. Yes, you had an old country, being Britain, coming over and putting its laws and everything in place over here. But there was a lot still up in the air about how everything would look. If the United States could have extended manifest destiny over Canada, they would have. So it was a fight not that had anything to do with Canada, because it was 1867 when Canada came into being. It was a fight between an old and weakening empire and an insurgent one, being the U.S. And they were the ones who were fighting over Canada. So you had the Brits doing all kinds of things to try to prevent the Americans from coming over that border. They went and got Mennonite farmers from Russia to make farms down at the bottom of the Manitoba border, so it would be kind of a barrier against that. So it's quite interesting what could have happened. And when it got to 1867, you had the first Prime Minister of Canada, Macdonald. He had a deal with the Premier or whoever it was in British Columbia, that he had to get a train track and a train going across Canada right to the sea by a certain date, or British Columbia was going to become part of the States, and that you would have all of the West Coast right up to Alaska would have been American. And so he got in power, he was out of power, he was in power, he was out of power. He was just doing whatever he possibly could to get that railway built over incredibly difficult landscape. And so the borders could have looked dramatically different than they do now, depending on what had happened historically. And he was able to do it, and so the deal was done. So that was the yield crime in this godforsaken place, was basically the Louis Riel Rebellion, where Louis Riel he ended up being the first premier of Manitoba. He established that province, but he couldn't go and sit in his seat because he was wanted, because he did 2 rebellions, one in Manitoba and one in Saskatchewan. And basically, he was Métis, so he was French and Native. So he had been educated in Montreal. So he had an education and therefore more tools to be able to fight the encroachment of the laws and the rules and the regulations. He had a way to fight back on that and require them to make deals and that sort of thing. I have a fictional crime in there as well, where in that story you have a 22-year-old British immigrant who comes over because her mother, she's there when her mother dies in England, and her mother has regrets on her deathbed, saying, I lived my life in such a small compass, which is where the title came for the next book. I never went beyond my garden gate, and think of what I might have done had I the courage to, live out any of my imagination. So her daughter takes that to heart when her mother dies, and she and her father decide to come over to Northwestern Ontario and teach. And this is in 1885. And she gets here and he falls ill with consumption. And so she's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be left here on my own, trapped in this place. And the store owner is expressing far too much interest in her. So she feels trapped. And one way she feels that she can actually act on something is to buy a rifle and just do target practice out back. So one day she stumbles over a wounded Jesse James gang member, and she's bending over him to try to find out who he is. And she gets shot at from behind, wheels around with her rifle, and shoots dead the Pinkerton cop who was tracking him. So now she's got a big problem on her hands. So that launches her into her epic journey that's going to take her down through Manitoba into New York and to the Bill Cody Wild West show in New York. And I was 2 actual historical figures that I was interested in because they seemed like fascinating people. One was Gabriel Dumont, who you mentioned. And he, after the rebellion was over and they lost, he sought political asylum in the US. So he just rode south. Louis wouldn't go with him, but he just got out of the country. And I found him an interesting guy because apparently he was a brilliant tactician. And he wanted to do all kinds of stuff that could very well have changed the course of that rebellion. And Louis would say to him, no, God doesn't want you to do that. So he'd back off and not do it. So he was fighting a war with one hand tied behind his back. So I just found that an interesting kind of contradiction to a military man. You'd think he'd be more insistent, and he wasn't. So when he came down to the States, he made his way over and worked in the Bill Cody show. And the other person I was very interested in was Annie Oakley, being the Wayne Gretzky of her time, with a rifle instead of a hockey stick, because she was so much better than anyone else was anywhere. And the day I discovered that those 2 wound up at the Bill Cody show working together at the same time was when my whole plot clanged into focus. She had to go down there and meet up with them, which she does. So you get to meet Annie Oakley, and she has a proposition for Gabriel Dumont that he's motivated to live out. So it was fun doing the research for that, because it was kind of fiction meets history there as well. Sure. And then late in that novel, there's a jailbreak that she orchestrates. And so there's another crime. Every time I turn around, I'm creating crimes for some reason. So that's basically this godforsaken place. That's the trajectory with a number of crimes. Everything I hope for is my most recent historical. And it's a historical because it's set in 1972. And apparently if something is set, more than half of the story is set at least 50 years ago, it's a historical. So I'm a walking, talking historical here. And I said it in 1972. And So there are more recent crimes in that one as well. And she spends some time being a prison guard. So there's a crime aspect of that as well.
For that character, did you kind of draw on your own experience from working in a prison a little bit?
Yeah, it's the most sort of autobiographic in spirit novel that I'm ever going to write. I had been writing it for 40 years, looking for, you can't write life, because it doesn't, something that complicated and three-dimensional does not go down on a piece of paper. So I didn't have the writing chops at the beginning to be able to figure out a structure for it. So it's actually my fourth novel before I figured out how to do that. So I mesh things, I twist them, I don't claim any like this is not an autobiography, but yes, I drew a lot on my own experience for that. So there are more updated kind of crimes that would be more of a, first of all, there's the Rape Crisis Center, there's the Shelter for Victims of Domestic Violence. She has her own kind of domestic experience in this, and it is definitely a theme. The idea of crime is definitely a theme, but I don't think you would consider it old enough to be ye old.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Are you currently writing something new?
Well, currently I'm finding all of my time taken up with promotion, which is something that I am learning about being a writer, is you spend an awful lot of time on promotion. So I have come across a publisher who I love to death because she seems to love everything I write. So she has, she was the one who wanted to republish my romance. And she and I she's an artist as well. And I have a children's book coming out next year. And she did all the illustration for it. Yeah. And it's a story I wrote when my son was young because he was afraid of clowns. And so the whole thing, it's called Beat the Clown. And he has an imaginary friend, Puka, which he did back then, who helps him figure out how to confront his fear. There's a big painting on the wall of the library of a clown. And he says, just go up and push his nose, just beat the clown. And if you confront your fears, the fears cease to become that scary. And then it changes, and he's able to help the imaginary friend overcome his fear as well. So that's supposed to come out sort of next summer-ish. And then I have another book that arose from my academic work that's going to be a nonfiction book, and it is Abortion in Canadian Literature. And I analyzed novels that had been written by Canadian, because there's a very different understanding of that crime, depending on what country you're in. So you have the Irish, for example. It's a very Catholic understanding of abortion, and in the States, there's a Bible Belt there that sees it as very much as a religious thing. In Canada, it's understood very much more as a multicultural thing, as a cultural thing. And it's because Canada, in my opinion, Canada was split at the root from its inception culturally. Because basically what happened, my background's British. We had a war with the French. My husband's background is French. My kids were in French immersion. So the English had a war with the French, the English won, and then said, okay, let's be friends. Let's have a country together.
Yep.
So we'll run things, but you can stay and do whatever you want, and we'll just be cool with each other, okay? And we won't bother you, and you don't bother us, and everything will be fine. So Canadians from their inception have had this sense of, I won't bother you, you don't bother me. And that has actually worked into sort of the same thing with immigration. There's this idea that everybody just kind of leaves each other alone, and where America is the melting pot, Canada has always been referred to as a salad, where we're all here and we're just all going to live happily together, but we don't really have to know anything about each other. Where the Americans are more ambitious in that way, that we all have to have the same values. In Canada, it's much more loosey-goosey than that. So the idea of abortion is less religious here. I mean, there are pockets out in Alberta and in BC where you've got religious sort of pockets that would see it much the same way that the Americans do. But as for the rest of the country, we are the only Western country that does not have an abortion law. The only one. And it's because we had Dr. Henry Morgentaler. I don't know if that's a familiar name to you or not, but he was a doctor who single-handedly brought the nation to its knees over the abortion law. And it's because of him that the Supreme Court knocked down the abortion law. And you would have to have pretty much a consensus to put another law back in. And Canada's like herding cats. You would never get a consensus for that. So it's not an issue here. It's not something that anybody is trying to develop a law for. We haven't had a law since 1988, and everybody seems okay with it. So I was curious about that. What are the cultural underpinnings of us being unique like that? And so I went back and analyzed 7 different novels that have abortions in them. And I was looking at the cultural symbolism of what they were doing in that representation. And the conclusion I came to was that it was just on the basis of all, class and race and gender and all these things, that you need to leave each other alone.
Sure.
So I show how that happens in Canada.
Kind of as we're winding down before we go, is there anything else that we didn't discuss that you'd like to share with our listeners, whether that's about A Small Compass or anything else?
Well, I'd like to kind of turn it back on you and ask if you have any questions. Like, give me a little bit of your experience of reading A Small Compass. I'm asking this because you are wonderful in that you asked for the manuscript and actually read it. Most of the time I'm talking to people who haven't read the book. So You're special because you have. And I'd be interested in a little bit of, what your reaction was. Were there things that surprised you, made you mad, made you happy, things in it that you would want to point out?
Sure. And I am glad that I read it because I found it very fascinating, sort of the differing paths that both the women took to get to Canada, but also how similar their paths were kind of towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to kind of see Isobel's journey and sort of the struggles that she had coming in and being like, I want to have a child. I want to, get more out of this experience than just the adventure that I'm getting now that I'm here. And sort of her unique journey as she was navigating that with her love interest, which I won't spoil.
I hate to tell you this, but I made him up.
I wondered if he was real or not.
Yeah.
But, and how that aspect of her experience kind of shaped the rest of her time in Canada, and how it gave her a very unique perspective in life there after the birth. And then with Marie Anne, I was impressed with how, I don't want to say bullheaded because that's not really the right word, but how kind of steadfast she was in her beliefs and how she was not going to put up with any bullshit from Jean-Baptiste. And she was like, I am here. This is what's going to happen. And, come hell or high water, this is how things are going to go. And how he was just so in love with her that he was willing to capitulate to her demands. I mean, she wouldn't have been there otherwise in the first place. And how she was willing to put in the work, like you mentioned with the butchering of the bison and stuff. Like, she learned how to do all of that stuff.
She was not a wilting violet at all.
No, like and I'm sure as you kind of described at the beginning of her journey, how they kind of viewed her as this, kind of wilting flower as she's like riding along as a companion in the canoes and everything. But when it came down to it, she was willing to put in the work, and she really kind of carved her own path as well in, her life and her time there. And her willingness to kind of really go above and beyond when the issue with the children took place, and to really just kind of put herself out there like, Isobel would do this for me. There's no way I'm going to let this happen, and I'm going to make this right. And they both were really strong characters, and I really admired their steadfastness and how they weren't willing to compromise on what they wanted from their lives.
Yes, and that's inspiring for now, because they had more restrictions than now. And
Yes.
they were still able to carve a life that was meaningful to them because they just were
Yes.
not going to accept the limitations.
Yep.
And, they were going to be as inventive or as stubborn as they needed
Yep.
to be to do that. So it's inspiring, because if they could do it, why can't anybody do it now? That
Exactly.
we can find what's important to us if we have the courage to insist on it.
And also the fact that they were real people. Like this isn't a wholly fictional piece. I mean, there's components that are fiction, but it's for the story. The fact that they're real people, and these were women that actually did these things and had a real impact on, especially with Marie Anne, like on the country. And they helped shape things, and as you mentioned, like they're still well known and remembered to this day.
Well, she is. I don't think, I would say that if you ask most Canadians, do they know the name Isobel Gunn? They'd say no.
Sure.
Which is a shame, because she is a Canadian legend. She deserves to, Annie Oakley's a wonderful, larger than life American legend. And she
Sure.
has, compatriots in her, time and area that sort of kind of deserve celebration. So this is an attempt to let their stories be known as well.
And it is unfortunate that we don't kind of know the rest of her story to the degree that we know Marie
Yes,
Anne's.
Marie Anne's, yeah.
I'm thankful that you were able to find that asterisk and that you took the time to dig into her, because you're right, her story deserved to be told. And the fact that their stories coincided at the same time is...
That was just mind-blowing.
Yes.
Yeah. I suspect that Isabel's life was not very interesting in any particular way after that. She had her son, and she brought him up, but I suspect that she would have looked back her entire life and been very pleased that she did what she did.
I mean, getting off the island and not living a life where she's just going to be a farmer till she dies.
Yeah.
The fact that she took her life into her own hands and was like, no, I want something better for myself, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to take it. So that was very inspiring. But yes, I enjoyed the novel very much.
No, I'm so glad.
And on that note, I would like to thank you for taking the time to join me today. And again, the book is A Small Compass, and it is available in ebook and paperback. And we will have a link in the show notes so you can purchase a copy of your own in whatever format you prefer. I want to thank you so much again, Cinda, for joining me. And do you have any last things you'd like to say before I close out the episode?
Well, I'd just like to thank you too. It's a pleasure to talk about my book with somebody who's read it, and someone who is as interested in history as you are. And so this has been every bit as much a pleasure for me.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I'm Lindsay, and I'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.
Vrbo helps you swap gift wrap time for quality time. Go to Vrbo now and book a last-minute week-long stay and save over $390 this holiday season. Book your next vacation rental home on Vrbo. Average savings $396. Select homes only.